Do you remember those weird 1980s fads? The ones so absurd, it is hard to believe we ever went along with them? These fads swept through schools, malls, and living rooms, pushed until they became larger than life. What does it say about us that we let excess run that wild? Designer Pac-Man merchandise was everywhere in the 1980s, and it went way beyond the arcade. It started innocently with t-shirts and posters, but before long, Pac-Man was on everything from bed sheets to lunchboxes to breakfast cereal. If there was a flat surface, you could bet Pac-Man's yellow face would be plastered on it. Kids begged for Pac-Man board games, Pac-Man notebooks, even Pac-Man pajamas. The craze was so intense that families ended up eating Pac-Man-shaped pasta for dinner and waking up to Pac-Man cereal the next morning. The character was less a video game hero and more of an uninvited house guest that refused to leave. Every toy aisle seemed to groan under the weight of another spin-off. What made it weirder was that none of the merchandise really captured the fun of the arcade game. It was just branding slapped onto ordinary stuff. Yet people kept buying it, swept up in the mania of the moment. Looking back, it feels almost comical how one simple game turned into a marketing monster. Pac-Man went too far when it stopped being a game and started being a lifestyle you could not escape, no matter where you looked. Friendship dolls with hair you could cut and mail away were one of the strangest toy experiments of the decade. The idea was simple, if a little creepy. Kids were supposed to snip their doll's hair, put it in an envelope, and send it to the company for styling. A few weeks later, the hair would supposedly be returned as part of a makeover. Of course, most kids were horrified at the thought of hacking away at their doll's head, leaving it bald and patchy forever. Others tried it once, only to be disappointed when what came back did not look much better than what they sent. Parents quickly realized they were basically paying for their child to ruin a perfectly fine toy. The fad was short-lived, but while it lasted, it captured just enough curiosity to make its way into toy boxes across America. Looking back, it is easy to see why it flopped. Dolls were meant to be played with, not mailed like ransom notes. Friendship dolls proved that even in the 1980s, toy companies sometimes took things way too far in their quest for gimmicks. Pez dispensers were meant to be a fun way for kids to eat candy, but in the 1980s, adults turned them into something else entirely. Collectors started chasing rare designs, hunting through flea markets and toy shops to grab limited editions. Prices soared, and what had once been pocket change turned into big money. There were even stories of collectors fighting over fines, treating a plastic candy holder like buried treasure. Whole clubs formed around trading and cataloging every Pez ever made, with collectors showing off walls of carefully displayed dispensers. It stopped being about the candy and became a full-blown obsession. The fad got so big that counterfeit Pez dispensers started showing up, fueling the frenzy even more. Kids who just wanted the candy were baffled by the adults arguing over whether a particular dispenser was worth hundreds of dollars. Looking back, it is one of the weirdest examples of how the 1980s could take a simple toy and blow it completely out of proportion. The Pez collecting craze was proof that even the smallest fad could go too far once adults got involved. Reebok's Glow Sole sneakers were one of those products that sounded amazing but turned out to be a disaster. The idea was that every step you took would light up, making you look futuristic and cool. At first, kids were desperate to get their hands on a pair, especially after seeing the flashy ads. But once you started wearing them, the problems became obvious. The soles cracked quickly, the glow faded after only a few uses, and what looked futuristic turned into dull plastic strips. Parents were left regretting the steep price tag for shoes that barely lasted a season. For a while, glow sole sneakers were everywhere, on playgrounds, in malls, even at roller rinks. But their shelf life was short. They never quite achieved the staying power of other 1980s shoe fads like Air Jordans or LA Gear. Looking back, they stand out as one of those attempts to cash in on the future that ended up being embarrassingly short-lived. Reebok's Glow Sole sneakers are remembered less for their style and more as a cautionary tale of 1980s gimmicks that went way too far. The Wham-O Water Wiggle might just be the weirdest and most dangerous toy of the decade. It was basically a hose attachment with a plastic head that whipped around unpredictably, spraying water in every direction. On paper, it sounded like a fun way to cool off in the summer. In reality, it was chaos. The water wiggle spun so violently that it smacked kids in the face, tangled around ankles, and sometimes even broke windows. Parents were horrified when hospital visits started piling up from what was supposed to be a backyard toy. Despite the injuries, it was briefly popular because kids loved the mayhem. But lawsuits soon caught up with the company, and the toy was pulled from shelves. Looking back, it is hard to believe anyone thought a free-swinging, whipping water hose was a safe idea. The water wiggle is remembered today as a fad that went too far by mixing summer fun with genuine danger. Novelty Cola Wars gear was one of the strangest side effects of the Pepsi versus Coke rivalry. Suddenly, soda was not just something you drank, it was something you wore. Hats, pins, jackets, even duffel bags announced your loyalty to one brand or the other. Kids came to school decked out in Pepsi buttons, while others insisted Coke was the real thing, turning a soft drink choice into a weird badge of identity. Adults got in on it too, collecting branded merchandise like it was a sports team. There were even unofficial sides in some schools, with kids teasing classmates for being on the wrong team. Pepsi jackets, Coke windbreakers, and even neon shoelaces turned cafeterias into walking ad campaigns. The soda companies leaned into it, running contests and giveaways that made people feel like their brand choice was practically a lifestyle. Entire closets ended up looking like advertisements. The strangest part is that the gear was not particularly stylish. Most of it looked like cheap giveaways, but people wore it proudly anyway. The fad turned soda into a lifestyle, blurring the line between marketing and fashion. Looking back, it feels absurd that cola companies managed to convince people to literally dress as walking billboards. The Novelty Cola Wars gear was a prime example of how 1980s consumerism could turn the simplest product into a cultural obsession that went far too far. Puffy stickers were a schoolyard craze that went way over the top. These soft, bubble-like stickers had a 3D feel that made them irresistible. Kids collected them by the sheet, swapping them like baseball cards and sticking them on everything they owned. Binders, notebooks, and even bedroom walls were plastered with the glossy designs, turning school supplies into sticker galleries. Some kids had entire albums filled, carefully preserved like rare treasures. But the obsession was not just about collecting, it was about status. Having the rare unicorn or the biggest rainbow sticker earned bragging rights, and trades could spark arguments that lasted days. Some kids even started hoarding sheets without ever sticking them, treating them like art pieces instead of toys. But the longer you had them, the more the goo inside started to leak, leaving sticky stains behind. Teachers hated them because desks and lockers ended up covered in half-peeled stickers, and parents grew tired of replacing ruined furniture. Still, the fad raged on, fueled by the endless designs: rainbows, unicorns, smiley faces, and more. Looking back, the whole craze feels hilariously overblown, especially since the stickers did not even last. Puffy stickers proved that in the 1980s, even something as simple as a sticker could go too far. Fashion plastic charms on chains, better known as charm necklaces, were everywhere in the 1980s. Cheap, colorful, and noisy, they dangled around necks in the form of tiny sneakers, telephones, or roller skates. Kids collected dozens of them, proudly displaying their jangling collections at school. The bigger and noisier the chain, the better. It was a competition to see who could wear the most. Necklaces got so heavy that they clinked loudly with every step, turning classrooms into a chorus of plastic. Every mall kiosk had racks of them, and kids would spend hours picking out the perfect new charm for their chain. Some kids even tried to organize them by theme, like sports or food, though most just wore them all at once. Parents complained about how cheap they looked, but they still gave in because charms were one of the most requested birthday or allowance purchases. Parents groaned as they bought yet another set of charms for kids desperate to keep up with the trend. By the height of the craze, every mall kiosk and toy store sold bags of the little plastic trinkets. They were cheap enough to be addictive, but the fad burned out quickly once kids realized how silly they looked. Looking back, charm necklaces stand out as one of those weird fads that managed to take over schools before vanishing just as fast. They were proof that in the 1980s fashion could go too far, especially when it was made of plastic. Mini troll dolls as pencil toppers were one of the strangest school fads of the decade. Kids stuck the tiny, wide-eyed dolls on their pencils, letting their neon-colored hair fly around during class. Desks soon became cluttered with toppers in every shade. Some kids swore the trolls brought luck on quizzes, rubbing their neon hair before filling in answers. Others simply liked brushing the hair during class, which drove teachers crazy. The dolls were brittle too, and half the time they cracked or snapped off inside erasers, leaving kids with useless stumps of plastic. Of course, the hair tangled, the dolls cracked, and half of them snapped off inside erasers. Still, kids kept buying them, convinced they brought good luck on tests. Trolls went from quirky collectibles to clutter overnight. Teachers were not amused, as classrooms filled with distracted kids brushing troll hair instead of taking notes. The fad eventually died out, but for a few years, it felt like every kid in America had one. Looking back, troll pencil toppers were cheap, silly, and ultimately pointless, but they perfectly captured how the 1980s could turn anything, no matter how odd, into a nationwide craze. Glow-in-the-dark shoelaces were one of those fads that seemed like a brilliant idea until reality set in. Kids laced them into their sneakers, eager to show them off at roller rinks and school dances. At first, they looked cool under black lights, glowing brightly with every step. But out on dark streets, the glow faded quickly, and the stiff plastic laces became a tripping hazard. Parents complained that they broke too easily, leaving kids with shoes they could not tie. Within months, glow laces went from must-have accessory to trash can filler. Despite their flaws, they were briefly everywhere, with entire displays in mall stores dedicated to them. Looking back, they feel like one of the most too-far fads of the 1980s. Fun in theory, but a failure in practice. Glow-in-the-dark shoelaces stand out as a reminder that not every flashy idea from the decade had staying power. Novelty sunglasses in the 1980s came in every ridiculous shape you could imagine. Hearts, slits, shutters, stars. They were less about seeing and more about being seen. Kids wore them to school dances, roller rinks, and pool parties, strutting around like fashion icons even though they could barely see straight. The shutter shades were especially popular, even though the horizontal plastic bars made it feel like you were looking through a fence. Parents groaned, pointing out that they were useless in the sun, but that never stopped kids from wearing them indoors at night just to look cool. Photographs from the decade are filled with grinning kids, tilting their heads because they literally could not see through their glasses. What started as a quirky accessory ended up cluttering dollar store bins by the end of the fad. The heart-shaped and oversized star versions cracked easily, and the paint peeled off after a few weeks. Still, kids begged for them, caught up in the craze of being bold and outrageous. Looking back, novelty sunglasses were a perfect snapshot of the 1980s. Bright, silly, impractical, and impossible to ignore. They went too far by pretending to be fashion when they were really just toys for your face. Scratch and sniff clothing was one of the strangest attempts to extend a simple sticker gimmick into an everyday accessory. Shirts, hats, and even socks were printed with fruity or candy scents baked in. The idea was that every time you scratched the design, a fresh scent would waft out. At first, it was a novelty hit. Kids loved walking around smelling like bubble gum or grape soda. But reality set in quickly. After a wash or two, the scents became faint, strange, or downright sour. Parents complained about laundry smelling like spoiled fruit, and teachers rolled their eyes when classrooms started reeking of artificial strawberries. The fabric stained easily, and the cheap material made most of the clothing uncomfortable. Despite the issues, ads promised a revolutionary blend of fashion and fun. Kids paraded around like walking scratch and sniff stickers, oblivious to the fact they smelled less like candy and more like cleaning supplies. The fad fizzled fast, leaving behind piles of unsold scented shirts in bargain bins. Looking back, Scratch and sniff clothing was doomed from the start. Proof that some things are better left on stickers and never meant for your laundry basket. Sticker albums with puffy pages turned trading stickers into a full-blown obsession. Kids brought them to school like secret treasure troves, each page padded and glossy, made to hold their collections. Puffy stickers fit perfectly, creating colorful spreads of unicorns, rainbows, and cartoon characters. Playground negotiations turned into serious business, with kids swapping duplicates like miniature Wall Street traders. Some kids became territorial, refusing to even let others touch their albums for fear of bent pages or sticky fingers. The albums themselves were poorly made. Plastic rings broke, pages peeled apart, and the adhesive often melted in the sun. More than one kid cried after their prized album disintegrated in a backpack. Still, sticker albums carried social weight. Having a thick one meant you were in the sticker elite, while kids with only a few sad pages felt left out. Parents grew frustrated, spending money on endless sticker packs only for the albums to collapse under their own gooey weight. Looking back, sticker albums were one of the weirder 1980s fads, taking something harmless and turning it into a fragile obsession that often ended in disappointment. They went too far by pretending to be collectibles when they were really just poorly built binders of sticky paper. Shoelace decorators were plastic clips, beads, and jingling attachments that kids used to customize their sneakers. Suddenly, shoes were not just for walking, they were noisy fashion statements. Every step clicked, clinked, or rattled as beads swung back and forth. Kids paraded around school halls like walking maracas, convinced their noisy shoes made them cooler. But the fad came with problems. The plastic cracked, clips snapped off mid-run, and beads got lost in playground gravel within days. Teachers hated the noise, and parents tripped over stray beads rolling across the floor. Soon, many schools banned them altogether. Despite this, companies kept releasing new shapes and colors, from neon stars to cartoon heads, hoping to squeeze a little more money from the fad. But it was too late. The novelty had worn thin. Kids realized their decorated shoes were less practical and more of a nuisance. Looking back, shoelace decorators are remembered as one of those cheap gimmicks that sounded fun but quickly went too far. They turned sneakers into toys, and nobody really missed them when they disappeared. Designer lunchboxes for teens were an odd attempt to stretch childhood trends into adolescence. In the 1980s, companies decided that older kids and even high schoolers needed stylish metal or vinyl boxes to carry sandwiches. They marketed them as fashion accessories, complete with trendy logos, faux leather straps, and shiny finishes. Teens proudly carried them for a while, trying to match them to their outfits. But the boxes were flimsy. Metal ones dented at the slightest bump, while vinyl cracked and peeled within weeks. Worse, the insulation was so poor that food often came out soggy or warm. Parents groaned about wasted money, and teens eventually ditched them for plain brown bags. The fad was short-lived, but while it lasted, it turned cafeterias into runways of gaudy lunch containers. The attempt to make lunchboxes fashionable backfired, proving that not every childhood staple needs a teenage makeover. Looking back, designer lunchboxes for teens were a weird blip in the 1980s, one of those fads that promised sophistication but delivered broken handles and smelly sandwiches instead. Rubber pencils were floppy novelty items that fascinated kids but frustrated teachers. These bendy pencils could twist, coil, and bend into shapes, but when it came to actual writing, they were almost useless. Kids loved them for the silliness, bringing them to school as status symbols. They pulled them out of pencil cases, bending them into knots and pretending to tie them like shoelaces. But the rubbery lead smudged across pages. The tips broke constantly, and sharpening them was nearly impossible. Teachers scolded students for wasting time playing with them instead of writing. Parents soon realized they were spending money on glorified toys instead of school supplies. Despite this, the fad spread fast, with entire displays at stationery stores dedicated to the bendy pencils. For a brief time, they were everywhere, stuffed into stockings, handed out as party favors, even traded like collectibles. But their impracticality killed them off quickly. Looking back, rubber pencils were one of the purest examples of a fad that went too far by ignoring function for novelty. They were fun for 5 minutes, but useless for what they were meant to do. Record your own voice toys were handheld gadgets that let kids record a few seconds of audio and play it back. They seemed revolutionary at the time. Imagine hearing your own voice in a world where tape recorders were still clunky and expensive. Kids laughed hysterically, recording silly sounds, secret messages, and prank material. But the recordings were scratchy and distorted, often cutting off mid-sentence. The toys broke easily, with buttons sticking and batteries draining after just a few uses. Parents found them annoying, especially when kids played back endless burps or shrieks. Despite the flaws, they sold well, feeding into the 1980s love for tech gadgets. Every toy aisle featured a different brand, each promising more recording time or better playback. But none of them lived up to the hype. Looking back, record your own voice toys were hilarious in the moment, but flimsy in reality. They went too far by pretending to be high-tech when they were really just plastic noisemakers destined for the junk drawer. Atari add-ons were some of the most overhyped failures of the 1980s. The company, eager to cash in on the home gaming boom, kept releasing bizarre accessories that promised to revolutionize play. The most infamous was the Atari MindLink, a headband that supposedly let you control games with your thoughts. Ads showed players staring intently at screens, moving characters just by concentrating. In reality, the device never worked. The sensors picked up random muscle twitches, not brainwaves. Other add-ons were equally disappointing: oversized keyboards, clunky 3D glasses, and voice modules that barely understood a word. Gamers who spent money on them were left with piles of useless plastic gathering dust. The hype around these add-ons fueled unrealistic expectations, and many players felt duped. Looking back, Atari's obsession with add-ons showed just how far 1980s gaming companies were willing to push gimmicks. Instead of improving gameplay, they created expensive toys that promised the future but delivered frustration. The add-on craze was one of the clearest examples of how 1980s fads went too far, especially when technology could not keep up with the marketing. Magnetic earrings and clip-ons for boys were a very brief but very memorable fad. In the 1980s, pierced ears were trendy, but many schools and parents still frowned on it for boys. The solution? Cheap magnetic studs or plastic clip-ons that mimicked the look without the hole. Boys strutted into school wearing neon studs or tiny hoops, showing off their rebellious side. But teachers quickly cracked down, banning them for being distracting or against dress codes. The magnets pinched uncomfortably and clip-ons fell off constantly, often lost in the middle of gym class. Parents were not thrilled either, calling them silly or inappropriate. Despite this, the fad burned bright for a short while, giving kids a taste of edgy style without permanence. By the end of the decade, the trend had fizzled, leaving behind only a few photos of awkward school portraits featuring shiny fake earrings. Looking back, magnetic earrings and clip-ons went too far by trying to force rebellion into cheap accessories that hurt more than they helped. Plastic phone shoulder rests were marketed as revolutionary in the 1980s. They clipped onto your handset, creating a little perch so you could cradle the phone between your shoulder and ear. The idea was to free up your hands for typing, writing, or chores. At first, they seemed brilliant, no more aching arms during long calls. But the clunky plastic often slipped off mid-conversation, sending phones clattering to the floor. They were uncomfortable, awkwardly sized, and prone to cracking after just a few uses. Worst of all, they made you look ridiculous, hunched sideways with a giant plastic contraption on your phone. Offices tried them, homemakers bought them, and for a brief time, they were everywhere. But people soon realized it was easier to just hold the phone or wait for better tech. The fad vanished almost overnight once cordless phones and headsets arrived. Looking back, plastic phone shoulder rests were a classic 1980s overcorrection, taking a real problem and solving it in the most awkward way possible. They went too far by adding bulk and inconvenience instead of real comfort. Novelty desktop aquariums with plastic fish were marketed in the 1980s as the futuristic way to brighten up an office or bedroom. The pitch was simple. You could enjoy the calm of an aquarium without the hassle of cleaning tanks or feeding real fish. These little plastic boxes were filled with colored water, plastic coral, and fake fish that floated aimlessly as bubbles from a tiny pump pushed them around. At first, they seemed like a cool conversation piece, something that screamed modern and high-tech. Kids begged for them, and adults bought them as quirky gifts. But the illusion fell apart almost immediately. The pumps were loud, producing an endless gurgling hum that was more annoying than relaxing. Worse, many of them leaked, leaving stained desks and soggy paperwork in their wake. Parents who thought they were avoiding responsibility ended up mopping up puddles anyway. Within weeks, the plastic aquariums lost their charm, turning into bubbling nuisances with cloudy water and peeling decals. They cluttered desks, collected dust, and often broke down completely. Some people tried to fix them with tape or glue, but most ended up in the trash long before their warranty expired. Looking back, these novelty aquariums were the perfect example of how the 1980s loved anything that looked futuristic, even if it was just noisy plastic. They went too far by trying to replace something beautiful, real fish, with a gimmick that could never live up to the promise. Hologram trading cards were supposed to be the next big leap in collectibles. Regular baseball and comic cards were already hot commodities, so when holograms came along, kids thought they were holding the future in their hands. These cards shimmered with rainbow-like images that appeared to move when tilted, dazzling anyone who saw them under fluorescent lights. Companies poured money into producing them, selling them at premium prices compared to regular cards. For a brief moment, hologram cards were everywhere, and kids traded them like treasure. But reality caught up quickly. The holograms scratched easily, leaving ugly marks that ruined the effect. Many bent or peeled, revealing the cheap cardboard underneath. Parents who shelled out for special edition packs discovered the so-called magic faded fast. Despite the hype, the cards never held their value, leaving disappointed kids with stacks of expensive junk. Worse, the technology at the time was fragile and inconsistent, so some cards barely worked at all. Looking back, hologram trading cards perfectly capture the too-far spirit of the 1980s, taking a simple joy, like collecting, and drowning it in gimmicky technology. They promised futuristic wonder but delivered little more than a shiny disappointment. Sticker-covered skateboards were one of the loudest, most chaotic fads of the 1980s. Kids plastered every inch of their boards with neon stickers, band logos, cartoon characters, and anything they could peel and stick. The result was a deck so cluttered it was almost impossible to tell what it looked like underneath. For a short time, stickered skateboards were the ultimate symbol of rebellion and creativity. You could express your identity one sticker at a time. Skate shops even sold sticker packs specifically for decorating boards. But as soon as the board hit the pavement, the flaws showed. Stickers peeled, tore, and rolled up at the edges. Rides left them covered in dirt, grease, and rain until the once colorful collages looked like trash. The added layers sometimes even made boards slippery, sending kids tumbling during tricks. Parents hated the mess, and teachers confiscated stickers that were peeled off lockers and desks to add to the collection. Still, kids pressed on, convinced their boards were cooler than anyone else's. By the end of the decade, most stickered skateboards were chipped wrecks, their collages half-peeled and unreadable. Looking back, the fad went too far by turning a functional piece of sports equipment into an art project doomed to destruction. It was a perfect snapshot of 1980s excess, bright, bold, and destined to end in a crash. Mini electronic pets before Tamagotchi were some of the strangest and most annoying gadgets of the 1980s. These handheld devices promised companionship in the form of crude pixel blobs on tiny LCD screens. Kids were told they could feed them, play with them, and keep them alive. At first, the idea felt groundbreaking, an electronic friend you could take anywhere. Kids begged parents for them, convinced they were adopting a futuristic pet. But in practice, the pets were little more than blinking shapes that beeped endlessly. They drained batteries overnight, reset randomly, and often died no matter what you did. Parents were driven crazy by the constant beeping, especially in classrooms or long car rides. Teachers banned them, calling them distractions, while parents tossed them into drawers to preserve their sanity. Still, kids carried them proudly, pretending to bond with what looked like a digital amoeba. The devices were fragile, buttons stuck, and most broke within weeks. Yet they kept coming back in different forms until the Tamagotchi craze of the 1990s finally perfected the idea. Looking back, these early digital pets were a fad that went too far by promising companionship, but delivering only frustration and dead batteries. They paved the way for the future, but left behind a trail of noisy disappointment. Trucker hats with built-in radios might be one of the weirdest crossovers of fashion and tech the 1980s ever attempted. On paper, the idea sounded genius. You could wear a cap and listen to your favorite AM or FM station without carrying a Walkman. Ads showed smiling teens nodding to music with antennas poking out of their caps. The hats came in neon colors, mesh backs, and oversized bills, screaming 1980s style. For a short time, they were a quirky novelty that actually turned heads, but the reality was clunky. The sound quality was tinny and weak, the batteries died quickly, and the hats were heavy and uncomfortable. Antennas bent or snapped after a week, leaving kids with useless plastic caps. Parents laughed at the gimmick, calling them impractical even by fad standards. Despite their flaws, radio hats popped up at fairs, malls, and gift shops everywhere, selling just enough to fuel the craze. They became the punchline of fashion tech, remembered less for music and more for making wearers look ridiculous. By the time Walkmans and better portable devices took over, radio hats were already on the clearance racks. Looking back, they perfectly capture the spirit of 1980s fads. Wild ideas taken way too far, blending fashion and technology in ways nobody really asked for. VHS rental adventures were more than just picking a movie. They were the night's main event. You walked into the store greeted by rows of clamshell cases, each one shouting for your attention with over-the-top artwork and dramatic taglines. New releases lined the front wall, but they were often already rented, marked by empty plastic holders and your own growing disappointment. So you wandered. Comedy? Horror? Something animated for your little brother? You judged movies by their cover. You flipped tapes to read the backs, squinted at blurry screenshots, and made last-minute switches at checkout. There was pressure. Choose wisely. You had this movie for 2 nights, maybe 3. Forget to rewind? Expect a fee. Some stores even had a "Be Kind Rewind" sign that became a national motto. You got home, made popcorn, and watched together as a family. The sound of the tape sliding into the VCR meant it was officially movie night. VHS rentals turned average evenings into little adventures. They made choosing a movie feel like a quest. And even though we stream everything now, nothing beats the charm of browsing those old shelves and hoping your top pick had not been snatched first. Using public transportation exclusively meant your life moved on someone else's schedule. There was no jumping in the car for milk, no last-minute rides. You waited. At bus stops, on corners, in the rain, in the cold, in your Sunday best or your work shoes. The bus was never early. Sometimes it was late. But you waited. You held a pocket full of exact change. Maybe a transfer stub. You knew the routes like the back of your hand. You sat near the front if you were tired. In the back if you did not want to talk. You watched strangers argue, laugh, cry. You saw your city from a different view, block by block, stop by stop. Owning a car seemed like another world. Gas, insurance, repairs. Those were luxuries. The bus was what you had. And it was enough. Sort of. It got you to school, to work, to church. You learned to carry groceries in bags that would not break. You made friends with the drivers. You memorized delays. And when the ride was over, you stepped off into whatever came next. Public transportation did not just move you. It taught you patience, resilience, and how to hold on when the brakes hit hard. Blank VHS tapes were not just empty plastic boxes. They were treasure chests, the kind you could label, relabel, and fill up with your own little corner of television history. You remember the sound, right? That whirring click as the VCR accepted your latest recording project, whether it was The Muppet Show, a Disney movie airing on Saturday night, or just some random commercials you ended up watching later like they were rare artifacts. Back then, taping something off television was serious business. You had to time it perfectly. Hit record at just the right moment, or risk catching the tail end of a news anchor saying, "And now," before your show started. Fast-forwarding past commercials felt like a power move. Rewinding? An art form. And if you had one of those little tape rewinder machines shaped like a car, you were basically living in luxury. You wrote on those little white stickers with a level of care that rivaled school projects. Do not tape over. Disney only. Toys R Us ad. Keep forever. And when someone in the house recorded over your stuff with a football game, that was war. But if you wanted to really test your patience and your brain power, there was only one screen-based challenge that ruled them all. It looked like a cabinet, just a little rectangle in the wall with a tiny knob. But open it up and suddenly you had an ironing board swinging down like a Murphy bed for your clothes. Fold-out ironing boards in the wall were the peak of space-saving genius. These things were especially popular in mid-century homes, when every inch of space had to count. The board folded out flat, usually right next to the laundry area or inside the kitchen pantry. You did not have to drag a heavy metal contraption from the closet. Just pop it open, plug in the iron, and get to work. Some even had a tiny shelf or built-in plug to hold the iron itself, along with a little light above the board. Now that was fancy. Housewives adored these because they made chores quicker. And let's face it, they just looked slick. Like the house was in on the secret with you. Eventually, though, as trends moved toward larger laundry rooms and portable everything, these ironing stations disappeared. But for the folks who grew up with one, there is a real nostalgia there. It was like opening a secret door into domestic life. Now, speaking of secret doors, the next one was not about cleaning your shirt. It was about making sure your closet smelled like the forest. Riding in the front seat as a toddler was practically a family tradition. Small kids either bounced on the bench seat beside mom or perched on dad's lap, helping steer the wheel. Car seats existed, but they looked like metal torture devices, so most families ignored them. Toddlers loved standing up on the seat, hands gripping the dashboard like they were captains of a ship. At red lights, some kids leaned out the window, hair blowing wildly in the breeze. Some even pretended to shift imaginary gears or honk the horn like they owned the road. Parents laughed instead of worrying, proud that their little driver was taking charge. Long drives turned into games of counting cars or waving at truckers who always honked back. The smell of vinyl mixed with cigarette smoke made the ride feel like its own world. Looking back, it is hard to believe nobody thought twice about letting toddlers ride shotgun. Parents beamed proudly as little ones steered through the driveway, pretending to control the massive car. On long drives, naps happened, stretched across the entire seat, no restraints in sight. One quick brake check and everyone rolled forward into the dashboard like it was nothing. Toddlers slid side to side during turns, giggling while parents reached out a single arm to keep them from falling. Seatbelts stayed tucked into the seat cracks, never touched. Today, it would be a reckless endangerment charge, but back then, it was considered adorable. A front seat toddler was just part of family driving culture in the 1970s. Waterbeds promised the future and delivered waves of regret. On paper, they were perfect, a heated mattress that cradled your body like a floating dream. But in practice, not so much. Every turn sent ripples across the surface. You tried to roll over, and the whole bed sloshed like a bathtub during an earthquake. Getting in without making a tidal wave was a skill. Getting out without sliding to the floor was an Olympic event. They were heavy, hard to move, and leaked at the worst times, usually at 3 in the morning, soaking everything from socks to shag carpet. Still, they were trendy. If someone had a waterbed, it meant they were either incredibly cool or easily convinced by an in-store demo. Some people swore by them. Others swore at them. Pets hated them. Kids loved jumping on them. until they learned that waterbeds and sharp objects do not mix. But for a brief, glorious window in the 1980s, having a waterbed meant you had arrived. It was furniture and flex all in one. Looking back, they were impractical, ridiculous, and unforgettable. And somewhere, in a dusty corner of a basement, one is still gently sloshing, waiting for its comeback. Limited access to cable television in the 1980s meant your world came through rabbit ears. You had the basics, network channels, maybe a grainy local station or two. But when friends talked about Nickelodeon, MTV, or the Disney Channel, you just smiled and nodded, pretending you knew what they meant. Your TV had an antenna wrapped in aluminum foil. Your Saturday mornings were for cartoons on the few channels that came in clear. You learned to adjust the rabbit ears just right, then sit perfectly still, because moving even an inch might send the screen back into static. You missed out on the cable exclusive shows, the big movie nights, the flashy channels with round-the-clock music videos. You got public access, reruns, and news that ended with the national anthem. At school, you heard about shows you never saw. You laughed along anyway. At home, you made the most of what you had. Limited channels meant fewer choices, but also fewer arguments. You watched whatever was on. You made it work. And you learned something strange. When there was only one option, it often became your favorite. The picture was not perfect, but it was yours. And sometimes, that was enough. Made-for-television movies in the 1980s were not just filler. They were events. Whole nights were planned around them. When that promo would come on, this Sunday, only on ABC. You would perk up, lean in, and make mental notes to not miss it. This was before DVR, before pause buttons. You missed it? You missed it. These movies had titles like The Day After, V, The Final Battle, or The Ewok Adventure. Some were tearjerkers, some were thrillers, some were straight-up terrifying, and they had you glued to the screen, wondering how they managed to squeeze so much drama into 2 hours. Plus, commercials. Families would make popcorn, dim the lights, and treat it like it was an actual premiere. You watched it live together, and you talked about it the next day at school. Because chances were, everyone saw it too. They hit different. The music, the narration, even that grainy picture. It all added to the mood. You were not just watching. You were part of something. And right in the middle of those movies came the strange intermissions, ones that could go from innocent to haunting in 5 seconds flat. Parents giving kids sips of beer or wine at parties was not only normal, it was considered good parenting. Adults called it teaching responsibility, handing over a foamy sip of beer or a watered-down glass of wine. Kids wrinkled their noses, laughed at the bitterness, and ran off to play. Sometimes uncles made a show of it, raising their glass and declaring, "Make a man out of him." Relatives chuckled as kids pretended to stumble dramatically after a sip. Some parents even bragged about their kids being beer-trained, showing them off at barbecues. Grandparents chuckled knowingly, saying this was how it had always been done. Nobody worried about laws or child services. It was seen as harmless fun. Kids strutted around parties feeling special for being included. It was less about alcohol and more about being treated like part of the adult world. Beer cans were passed casually between adults and children without a second thought. A sip of wine at Christmas or Thanksgiving was practically a rite of passage. Parents defended it by saying kids would not sneak around later if they learned early. Relatives bragged about letting their kids learn early so they would not go wild later. Nobody thought it strange. Nobody called it illegal, and kids strutted around proudly after their first grown-up sip. Today, it would spark outrage, but in the 1970s, it was a family ritual. Poor families especially saw it as harmless, a way to include the kids in the celebration without spending money on soda. Neon everything was not a trend. It was a takeover. Shirts, socks, shoelaces, scrunchies. If it could be worn, it could be neon. Bright pinks, electric greens, yellows so vivid they could stop traffic. Walk into a classroom in the 1980s, and you might see a dozen students glowing like highlighters. It was not subtle. It was not sophisticated. but it was unforgettable. Neon made sure you were seen from across the street, or the roller rink. Entire outfits were built around one blinding shade. And the braver kids? They mixed them. A neon blue shirt with neon orange shorts and lime green shoelaces. Why not? Matching was optional. Visibility was everything. Neon told the world you were loud, proud, and unbothered by what anyone else thought. It showed up in birthday parties, aerobics tapes, and mall photo booths. Looking back now, it seems like a color explosion. But that was the magic. Neon was confidence in color form. It was youth, amplified. It was chaos, celebrated. And for those who wore it without a hint of irony, it was the brightest part of a decade that refused to dim. Back before virtual reality, Viewmaster reels were the closest thing to teleportation we had. A small red plastic viewer, chunky and indestructible, that you held up to your face like some kind of sci-fi binoculars. But inside, whole worlds waited. You'd flick the lever with your thumb and instantly jump from a still frame of Mount Rushmore to a three-dimensional jungle scene with elephants that felt like they could walk right out of the frame. Some reels were cartoons, others were travel photos. Some were straight-up educational, which somehow made you like them even more. They were quiet, simple, and personal. You did not share your Viewmaster. That was yours. A private little universe. Every kid had their favorite reel. Maybe it was the one with dinosaurs. Maybe it was the space shuttle. Whatever it was your escape hatch from a math worksheet or a rainy Saturday. The 1980s weren't about flashy screens or downloads. They were about plastic, paper, light, and wonder. And somehow, that was enough. Actually, it was more than enough. But if you really wanted to feel like you were holding the future in your hands, you did not stop at a Viewmaster. You went for the gadget that talked back. Limited or no air conditioning meant summer nights were a battle with the heat. The box fan sat in the window, humming like a tired engine, barely moving the thick air. You sweated through your sheets, drank warm water, slept with the lights off and the windows wide open, hoping for a breeze that never came. Some homes had one window unit, and it stayed in the living room. Everyone gathered there like refugees from the sun. No one moved. The couch was soaked in humidity. Tempers flared, ice trays emptied fast. You wore as little as possible, stuck your head in the fridge, and counted the hours until dark. At school, kids talked about central air. You could not imagine it. The idea of a whole house being cool felt like science fiction. You made popsicles out of juice in ice cube trays. You wrapped wet washcloths around your neck. You laid on the floor, hoping the tile was cooler than the bed. And through it all, you survived. Uncomfortable, sticky, and half asleep, but alive. No air conditioning was not ideal, but it made you tough, and it taught you how to endure heat, not just in your house, but in life. Trick-or-treating until midnight with no adults was a rite of passage in the 1970s. Once the sun went down, entire neighborhoods transformed into a candy-collecting free-for-all, and parents barely paid attention. A pillowcase or brown paper bag was your ticket, and you ran wild with your friends, pounding on doors until porch lights flickered off. Kids cut across yards, darted into alleys, and bragged about who scored the most candy bars. Streetlights meant nothing. The game was still on, long after dark. The older kids led the charge, dragging younger siblings along like soldiers in a candy army. Piles of chocolate bars and hard candy were dumped onto bedroom floors at the end of the night, traded like baseball cards. Nobody checked for tampering, and homemade treats were eaten without hesitation. Running out of candy was the only real danger. The freedom of the night made kids feel unstoppable. No costumes with reflective tape, no glow sticks, just kids disappearing into the night with nothing but sugar-fueled energy. Some bags ripped open halfway through the night, spilling candy all over the pavement. But that was part of the adventure. Strangers handed out treats without suspicion, and nobody checked wrappers for safety. Today, parents would never let a 6-year-old roam streets past bedtime, but in the 70s, it was just part of the fun. Trapper keepers were not just school supplies, they were status symbols. With their Velcro flaps and glossy, over-the-top covers, they turned every classroom into a silent competition of who had the coolest binder. Some featured racing cars. Others showed rainbows, unicorns, or abstract laser patterns straight out of a sci-fi fever dream. Inside, everything was neatly organized. Folders, dividers, loose-leaf paper, and secret notes passed during math class. The Velcro made a loud rip every time you opened it, an announcement that learning was about to begin, or at least be attempted. Trapper Keepers made you feel like you had your life together, even if your grades said otherwise. Teachers had a love-hate relationship with them. They were bulky, distracting, but undeniably effective at keeping your stuff in one place. And if you had one with a matching pencil case, you were royalty. Years later, people still remember the smell of the plastic, the feel of flipping through those laminated folders, and the thrill of sliding in a new pack of notebook paper. Trapper Keepers were not just for school, they were for showing off, staying organized, and feeling like you had a little piece of the future in your backpack. Limited extracurricular activities were just another way the world reminded you what you could not afford. Other kids had piano lessons, karate classes, and sports teams with matching uniforms. You had afternoons at home watching TV or playing outside with a stick and a rock. Sign-up fees were too high, equipment cost too much. Even the rides to practice were out of reach if the car was needed for work. You brought home the flyers from school and left them on the table, hoping. Sometimes they just disappeared. Sometimes your parents gently explained that maybe next time meant probably never. You cheered from the sidelines, you watched from the crowd, and you learned how to clap with a smile even when your heart wanted in. It was not fair, it stung, but you found other ways to grow. You read library books, you drew comics in the margins of your notebook, you played tag until the sun went down, and maybe you missed out on trophies and tournaments, but you learned resilience, creativity, and how to find joy in the quiet spaces. You might not have worn the jersey, but you still showed up, and that mattered. Speaking of things built right into the house, you are not going to believe what kind of doors were hiding inside the walls. For your milk. Picture this. You wake up, walk to the side of your kitchen, and open a tiny little door built right into your house. Behind it, a bottle of fresh milk, cool and ready to pour, maybe even some butter or cream depending on the day. No, it is not magic. That was the milk door, also called a milk chute. These small pass-through compartments were genius in their simplicity. One side opened from the outside, where the milkman would quietly place the day's delivery. The other opened from inside the house, so you never had to go out in your slippers or bathrobe. It was the drive-through window before there were drive-throughs. These doors were more than convenient. They were a sign that the world once ran on a shared rhythm. Everyone knew when the milkman came by. You could even leave payments or notes inside. Some had little shelves, others had insulation. And most people never locked them, because who would steal milk? Of course, once grocery stores and home refrigeration became widespread, the milk door quietly disappeared, sealed up, painted over, or just forgotten. But somewhere out there, behind layers of drywall, a few still exist. Hidden time capsules. The Pee-Chee folder was like a social billboard. Everyone had one. Those tan or yellow folders with athletes printed in faded ink on the front. Football players mid-tackle, baseball players mid-swing. They were meant to be neutral, practical, but they never stayed that way. Because the moment that folder landed on your desk, it became a war zone of doodles, lightning bolts, band logos, stencils, flames, hearts with names inside them, graffiti letters that took 15 tries to get right. Every inch of it became your personal art gallery or battlefield. These things aged like ancient relics by the time June came around. It did not matter how boring the class was. Your Pee-Chee folder made sure you had something to focus on, something to claim. And if a substitute teacher tried to take it away, that was a declaration of war. Of course, personal style extended beyond the page, because it was not just about what you carried. It was about what you wore. And in the 1980s, you had better know how to roll your jeans or risk social exile. Acid wash jeans were loud before you even opened your mouth. With their blotchy patterns and faded splotches, they looked like someone had taken a bleach bottle to denim, and somehow that became cool. These jeans were rebellious, messy, and unmistakably 1980s. Everyone had a pair. Some wore them tight-rolled at the ankle, others let them drape over high-top sneakers. Acid wash showed up in jackets, skirts, and full matching sets that turned entire outfits into walking eye strain. You could not blend in wearing acid wash. You stood out, and that was the point. It was denim with attitude. Rough, bold, a little chaotic. Parents hated it. Teachers rolled their eyes. But teens embraced the weirdness. It felt edgy, like you were wearing the uniform of a generation that refused to dress quietly. Old photographs now show groups of kids lined up in front of lockers, each one looking like they had just emerged from a bleach accident and loving it. Acid wash was not timeless, it was not flattering, but it was unforgettable. And in a decade known for excess, it fit right in. Even now, pulling on an old pair brings back the noise, the neon, and the thrill of breaking the fashion rules. MTV in the 1980s was not just a channel, it was a movement. The second you heard that iconic, "I want my MTV," you knew you were about to step into another world. A world where music lived on your screen, not just your speakers. Where your favorite artist could become a visual legend. It played music videos, actual music videos, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That meant you could go from watching Cyndi Lauper dancing through city streets to seeing Michael Jackson turn into a werewolf without ever leaving your couch. Music became cinematic. Performances became stories. Seeing someone on TV who made you feel like you were not the only weirdo out there. And maybe, just maybe, being a weirdo was cool. MTV introduced you to bands you never heard of, genres you never explored, and visuals that burned into your brain like neon on wet pavement. You would tape videos, argue over countdowns, and swear that your favorite video was art. But when you got back to school, it was back to basics, and one look at your folder would say everything your mouth could not. It was the original shortcut for busy kitchens, long before microwaves or DoorDash deliveries. Right there in the wall, usually between the kitchen and dining room, was a little opening known as a pass-through window. Not big enough to walk through, just big enough to pass a steaming pot of mashed potatoes or a stack of plates. It was part convenience, part conversation starter, and part dinner-time drama stage. You could poke your head through and call out, "Who wants seconds?" Or you could slide a dish over without juggling it across the carpet. In bigger homes, they were framed out in wood or tile with little ledges to rest a casserole on. In smaller homes, they were purely functional, a hole in the wall that saved mom 10 steps at every meal. Some even had shutters or swinging doors, so you could close the kitchen once dinner was served. But eventually, open-concept living took over. People tore down the wall entirely instead of carving a window into it. And just like that, the pass-through became passé. Still, it had its charm. It turned dinner into a kind of performance. But if passing potatoes through a hole in the wall sounds odd, imagine burning your garbage in a machine tucked right next to the toilet. Helmets? What helmets? In the 1970s, kids flew down streets on banana seat bikes, roller skated on cracked sidewalks, and zipped around on skateboards with zero protective gear. Bruised knees and scraped elbows were a daily badge of honor. If you came home without a new scab, people assumed you had not been outside long enough. Some kids even showed off their wounds like trophies, bragging about who had the biggest scrape. A cracked tooth or sprained wrist was brushed off as part of the adventure. Falls were expected, blood was shrugged off, and the solution was usually a garden hose rinse and a Band-Aid. Nobody thought twice about head injuries. If you crashed hard, you just got back up. Helmets existed, but they were for football players, not kids riding bikes around the block. Parents watched from porches, sipping coffee, laughing when kids toppled into bushes. A trip to the emergency room only happened if something was obviously broken. Looking back, it is amazing how many survived without serious injury. But for kids of the 70s, it was just part of the ride. Stirrup pants were the 1980s attempt to combine fashion with function, and they did neither particularly well. These leggings had a strap that looped under your foot, supposedly to keep them from riding up. In reality, they pulled awkwardly at your ankles, made your feet sweat, and caused socks to bunch in weird places. But we wore them anyway. They came in bright colors, bold patterns, and every synthetic material known to mankind. They were stretchy, shiny, and often paired with oversized sweaters or blazers that made no logical sense. From the knees up, you looked like a school principal. From the knees down, you looked like a gymnast caught mid-warm-up. But Stirrup pants had their moment. They were the go-to outfit for school picture day, mall trips, or just feeling like you belonged in a fashion catalog. The loop under the foot made you feel oddly secure, like your pants were holding onto you. Sure, they sagged in weird places. Sure, they made your calves look like sausages. But they were a staple, loved, mocked, and deeply missed. For anyone who wore them, Stirrup pants were more than a fashion choice. They were a commitment, a stretch of spandex, and a rite of passage. These 1980s fads may have gone way too far, but the memories still make us laugh. So tell us which one you survived in the comments. Tap like if it brought back the neon, and subscribe to keep the retro madness rolling.